On the morning of October 10th, 1974, a maid walked into a bedroom in one of the finest private houses in Paris and found her employer dead. The woman in the bed was 45 years old. She had been famous since before she was old enough to vote. She had once been married to the richest Greek alive, and she had died married to the second richest. And between those two men stood almost every headline of the century. Her name was Athina. Her family called her Tina. The world, when it bothered to remember her at all, remembered her as the first Mrs. Aristotle Onassis, the girl in the photographs beside the man who later married Jacqueline Kennedy. But the story the world kept was not the story that happened. 28 years earlier, a 17-year-old bride had stood in a New York cathedral and married a man more than twice her age, and that wedding built the largest private fortune rivalry the sea has ever carried. This film is about what that marriage made and what it destroyed. It is about a night on a private island in 1970 when her older sister was found dead in her husband's house, and about the file the Greek prosecutors opened afterward. And it is about the decision no one has ever fully explained. 17 months after her sister died, Tina married the widower. The courts examined that island death and cleared the man at the center of it. The record of that examination survives. So does the record of what happened to Tina next, and it ends in the Paris bedroom where the maid stopped screaming and called for help. 3 questions run through everything you are about to hear. How a teenage girl became the treaty between 2 warring fortunes. What the file from the island actually says. And why the woman who had every reason to run toward that house walked into it instead. If buried stories like this one belong in your evenings, subscribe to Tried and Buried. Athina Mary Livanos was born in London on the 19th of March, 1929, and the house she was born into did not think of itself as a family so much as a fleet. Her father was Stavros Livanos, a ship owner from the island of Chios, and by the time Tina could walk, his name stood among the most respected in Greek shipping. Respected is a cold word. It was meant to be. The Livanos operation was famous for something unusual in that world. It carried no debt it could not cover, took no risk it had not already survived, and wasted nothing. There is a story told in shipping circles that Stavros Livanos required his household to account for small change, in a house that controlled millions. The story comes from later memoirs and should be carried lightly, but the men who did business with him repeated it without smiling. The anecdotes of his frugality were practically a genre of their own in the London Greek colony, and they all carried the same moral. This was a man who had gone to sea young, mastered ships before he owned them, and built the fleet the old way, hull by hull, with no partner he had not married into, and no bank he could not walk away from. He regarded extravagance as a leak, and he regarded leaks as character. He had married Arietta Zafirakis, and together they raised 3 children. George, the son, would inherit the fleet, because sons inherited fleets. Then came the 2 daughters. Eugenia was born first, in 1926, or early 1927, depending on which record you trust, because in that world, even birth years bent to appearances. Tina came last, small, quick, and photographed from the beginning. Understand what a daughter was in the Greek shipping world of the 1930s, because nothing in this story works without it. A daughter was not raised to run ships. A daughter was raised to connect fleets. Marriage was the only merger these families fully trusted, and the girls grew up knowing it the way other children know their own address. To see how normal the abnormal was, look at the world these families made together. The Greek shipping dynasties of the diaspora, the Livanos and Goulandris and Imbirikos and Niarchos names, operated out of London and New York as a floating aristocracy with its own law. They banked together, chartered together, summered together, and married almost exclusively into each other, because a wedding was the only contract that could not be litigated. Sons apprenticed on the ships, daughters apprenticed on the guest lists. A girl's education was hospitality, languages, and presentation, and her examination was held in a ballroom, with the mother's grading. Tina's childhood moved between London, Paris, and New York, in staterooms and grand hotels, with governesses and dance lessons, and the particular loneliness of children whose parents are institutions. She was good at the surface of things: skiing, tennis, entrances. People who met her as a girl described brightness and charm, and underneath it, something harder to name, a kind of practiced lightness that never quite landed on any one thing. The war moved the family to New York, and it was there, in the spring of 1943, at the Plaza Hotel, that a Greek in his late 30s with thick hands and an immigrant's hunger first saw the Livanos' daughters. His name was Aristotle Onassis. He was not yet the most famous Greek in the world. He was a self-made tanker owner from Smyrna, a city that had burned behind him in 1922, and he had clawed his way up through Buenos Aires with a tobacco trade and a talent for being underestimated. The established families, the Livanos kind, looked at him the way old money always looks at fast money. He knew it. He collected the insult and kept it somewhere useful. There is a line attributed to Onassis from that first meeting at the plaza, that the Livanos girls were the whole point of the room. Like many Onassis lines, it survives in several versions, polished by the man himself over the years. What is documented is simpler and stranger. He asked Stavros Livanos for a daughter, and the negotiation that followed treated the request the way the family treated everything, as tonnage. Livanos is reported to have offered the elder daughter first, because that was the order in which daughters married. Onassis wanted the younger one. Tina was 14 when he first fixed on her, 17 when the deal closed, and if that sentence lands wrong in a modern ear, it landed wrong in some contemporary ears too. It did not stop the wedding. The courtship that filled those 3 years was conducted on 2 channels at once. Toward the girl, Onassis ran charm at full power, flowers, attention, the overwhelming focus that every witness to the man describes as physically warming, the sensation of being the only vessel on his sea. Toward the father, he ran a negotiation, patient, respectful, and relentless, a suitor presenting himself quarter after quarter like a balance sheet that kept improving. Which channel decided the matter is not seriously in doubt. Tina's feelings were never the closing condition. Her father's signature was, because here is the machinery under the romance. Stavros Livanos was not just placing a daughter, he was arming a rivalry. And to see it clearly, you have to meet the other man at the table. Stavros Niarchos was everything Onassis was not. Where Onassis was loud, Niarchos was glacial. Where Onassis charmed waiters and journalists, Niarchos collected impressionist paintings and silences. He came from a comfortable Athens family, moved through the Greek naval establishment, and built his tanker empire with a banker's precision and a duelist's memory. The 2 men had known each other for years. They cooperated when the money required it, and despised each other the rest of the time. In 1947, months after Tina married Onassis, Stavros Niarchos married her older sister, Eugenia. 2 sisters, 2 rivals, one father-in-law holding the anchor chain of both. The Livanos family had not chosen a side. It had bought both sides, and the two daughters were the receipts. The next generation was born directly into the crossfire. The children of the two households were first cousins, Eugenia's 4 and Tina's 2, one bloodline split between two warring flags. They shared grandparents, holidays, and eventually griefs, while their fathers shared lawsuits. Family occasions seated the heirs of both fleets at the children's table together, cousins raised to love each other by mothers whose husbands were trying to sink each other. Nothing about this story is stranger than its family tree. And the tree was planted deliberately by one man on 2 wedding days 16 months apart. People who study these families sometimes call the marriages dynastic strategy, as if strategy were bloodless. It was not bloodless. It put 2 girls in their early 20s and their teens into the center of the most vicious commercial rivalry of the post-war seas, and it made every family dinner a summit between hostile powers. Eugenia, quiet and dutiful. Tina, bright and watched. Neither of them ever chose the war. They were the territory it was fought across. That is the house Tina came from. Now watch what the wedding actually looked like. The marriage of Athina Livanos and Aristotle Onassis took place in New York on the 28th of December, 1946, at the Greek Orthodox Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. The bride was 17 years old. The groom was 40. And he had already rehearsed the future in his head so many times that the wedding may have felt to him like a formality the world was finally catching up to. The papers covered it as a fairy tale, which tells you mostly about the papers: a society wedding, a beautiful child bride, a rising tycoon, orchids and orthodox crowns, and a reception that gathered the exiled aristocracy of Greek shipping in one Manhattan room. Onassis was marrying above his origins, and everyone present knew it. That was the point of the room. Stop on one number for a moment. 17. At 17, a girl in that world had never controlled a bank account, never chosen a city, never spent an unchaperoned season anywhere. Tina went from her father's house to her husband's house the way a vessel changes registry. Even her wedding date had been fitted into the shipping calendar. Later, people who knew her said she spoke of the marriage's beginning without bitterness, which is its own kind of sad. She had been raised so completely inside the transaction that the transaction looked like weather. What did Onassis get? He got the Livanos name wrapped around his own, the establishment's daughter on his arm, and a father-in-law whose credit lines and connections steadied his wildest years of expansion. What did Livanos get? He got his surplus daughter placed inside a fleet that was growing faster than any conservative house would dare to grow, a hedge on the future, paid in family. And what did Tina get? She got a husband who adored her the way he adored his best acquisitions, publicly, lavishly, and on his own schedule. The honeymoon phase produced photographs that still circulate. Tina laughing on deck rails, Tina in Norel dresses, Tina looking like the invention of post-war glamour. She was, by the accounts of friends, sometimes genuinely happy in those first years. It matters to say that. This was not a prison from the first day. It became one by degrees, which is how the durable ones are built. 2 children came quickly. Alexander was born on the 30th of April, 1948, in New York. Tina had just turned 19, a mother before she was out of her own teens. Christina followed on the 11th of December, 1950. Onassis had his heir and his daughter. The dynasty had its future, and the marriage had performed its function so efficiently that the function began to show through the fabric. Because Aristotle Onassis had a way of being married that biographers have documented from every angle, and it amounted to this. The wife was a flagship. She was maintained, displayed, and birthed. He worked through the nights, vanished for weeks into deals and casinos and other rooms, and expected the flagship gleaming when the cameras came. Friends of Tina, quoted across the major biographies, describe a young woman increasingly alone in some of the most expensive real estate on earth. She was 21 years old, with 2 babies, a staff of dozens, and a husband whose empire was his actual marriage. She skied, she rode, she threw the parties the position required, and the brightness that people had noticed in the girl began, slowly, to read as performance. Here is where the rivalry enters the bedroom walls, because across the water, her sister Eugenia was living the mirror of her life with Stavros Niarchos, and the 2 husbands measured everything against each other: ships, art, islands, wives. When Onassis bought bigger, Niarchos bought rarer. When Niarchos acquired a private island called Spetsopoula, Onassis would eventually answer with an island of his own called Skorpios. The sisters found themselves conscripted into a comparison that never closed. Hold those 2 islands in your mind. Both of them are coming back into this story, and one of them will hold a body. And in 1953, he paid her the tribute that tells you everything about how he loved. At a German yard that year, his builders delivered a tanker of a size the seas had never carried, by most accounts the largest afloat in her day, and he christened the record breaker Tina Onassis. Think about the gesture honestly. He named the biggest object he owned after his wife, sent it around the world flying her name, and continued, at home, to treat the woman herself as one vessel in a fleet of interests. The ship got the headlines. The wife got the ship's name back, second-hand. In this marriage, that counted as devotion, and the awful thing is that by the standards of her world, it did. By the early 1950s, Onassis was assembling the fleet that would make him a legend, ordering tankers of a size the industry had never floated, and financing them with a nerve that terrified conservative houses like his father-in-law's. The money became oceanic. Estimates of the fortune at its height run to hundreds of millions of dollars in the currency of the day, billions in ours. The exact figure hardly matters. What matters is what that much money does to a household. It turns the household into a court, and a court needs a stage. In 1954, Onassis gave it one. He bought a decommissioned Canadian warship and spent a reported $4 million turning it into the most famous private vessel afloat. 325 feet of teak and marble and apatite. He named it after his daughter, the Christina. The bar stools on the Christina were upholstered with the skin of whales. The fireplace was lapis lazuli. There was a seaplane, a surgery, a Renoir in the master suite, El Greco in the study. Winston Churchill would doze on its deck. Greta Garbo, Cary Grant, kings in exile, presidents in waiting, all of them passed down its gangway. The ship was Onassis's answer to every drawing room that had ever hesitated before letting him in. No one hesitated now, and below decks, out of frame, the ship was also a nursery. Alexander and Christina did the bulk of their growing up aboard the Christina, in the care of nurses and stewards, 2 small children living inside a permanent state banquet. Alexander was piloting boats around the ship before most boys own a bicycle, competent, restless, hungry for the father who swept through his childhood like an inspection. Christina trailed the staff and watched the famous adults perform, a plain, watchful little girl in the most glamorous room on earth, learning early that in her family, Attention was a currency, and she was overdrawn. Both children, their biographers agree, worshipped and feared their father, and could never quite locate their mother through the crowd of guests. File that away. Every account of what Alexander and Christina became begins on those decks. Tina was the hostess of that floating court through the whole of its golden decade. If you have ever seen a photograph of mid-century glamour at sea, there is a fair chance she is in the frame, small and blonde and smiling the practiced smile. The world called her the luckiest woman alive. Keep that phrase somewhere. The world is going to use it about 2 more women in this story, and it is going to be wrong every time. Because by the mid-1950s, the marriage behind the photographs was already taking water. Onassis was rarely alone with his wife. The children were raised by staff on the ship's lower decks, seeing their father, by Alexander's own later bitter account, mostly as a force of nature that arrived and departed. Tina, not yet 30, had begun to slip away too, into the ski resorts and the fast set, into flirtations that the biographies record, and that Onassis, by the same accounts, minded less than his pride required. A marriage arranged as a merger was behaving like one, cold on the inside, profitable on paper, and waiting for a hostile bid. Before the bid arrives, you need to see what the merger survived first, because the 1950s tested this marriage with weapons heavier than boredom, and the way each test was absorbed tells you exactly who these people were. In 1953, Aristotle Onassis bought himself a country, not legally and not quite literally, but close enough that the country noticed. Through quiet purchases of a controlling stake, he took command of the Société des Bains de Mer, the old company that owned the Casino of Monte Carlo, the Hôtel de Paris, the Sporting Club, and most of the seafront that mattered in the Principality of Monaco. The press called him the man who bought the bank at Monte Carlo. Prince Rainier, who ruled the place, discovered that his realm's commercial heart now beat inside a Greek tanker fortune. For Tina, 24 years old that year, the purchase redrew her daily life. Monte Carlo became the family's stage set. The Christina moored in the harbor like a second palace. The apartments above the old casino filled with Onassis staff, and the woman who had been raised to preside now presided over the most photographed square mile in Europe, hostess to a nightly parliament of exiled royalty, American studio money, and every ambitious dress in the Mediterranean. Photographs from those seasons show her doing it faultlessly. They also show, if you look at enough of them in a row, how rarely her husband is standing beside her. The principality itself would eventually teach him the lesson every acquisition taught everyone else, that being owned by Aristotle Onassis was a weather system, not a partnership. Prince Rainier's early gratitude cooled year by year into sovereign resentment, and in the following decade, the palace engineered the share maneuvers that pushed the Greek out of his own casino kingdom. But that reckoning was far away in 1953. In 1953, there was only the harbor, the flashbulbs, and a 24-year-old hostess presiding over a rented country. Then came February 1954, and a morning that this family's mythology prefers to skip. In Washington, the United States government indicted Aristotle Onassis over the purchase of American surplus ships, through arrangements prosecutors said violated the citizenship requirements of the law. He flew to America and surrendered. The most glamorous shipowner alive was booked like any defendant, fingerprinted, photographed, and released on $10,000 bail to fight a case that threatened the legal footing of a meaningful piece of his fleet. Take the measure of that from inside the marriage. Tina was 25, with 2 children under 7, and the name she wore was now attached to a federal criminal docket. The Livanos discipline she had been raised in regarded indictment the way it regarded debt, as contamination. Her father had never needed a bail bond in his life. Her husband treated his own booking, by every account that survives, as a business expense with publicity attached, and he fought the case the way he fought everything, loudly, through counsel and to a deal. In December 1955, the matter was settled with a payment of $7 million and commitments around American-built ships. No one went to prison. The fleet sailed on. The photographs resumed. But something is visible in the record of those years if you stand back from it. Onassis, under pressure, did not contract. He expanded. While the American case was still open, his whaling fleet was making its own headlines on the far side of the world. The Olympic Challenger and her catchers worked grounds off South America in ways that governments protested, and in November 1954, Peruvian forces fired on and seized Onassis whaling ships in an incident that put the family name into the war news. Lloyds paid, lawyers argued. The fleet was eventually sold on to Japanese buyers at a profit, because with this man there was always a profit, and the profit was always the answer to every question anyone raised about how it had been made. That was the household weather of Tina's 20s. A casino principality for a front garden, a federal fingerprint card in the filing cabinet, warships shelling the family business between lunch and dinner. She learned, because her class learns it young, that none of it was ever to be discussed, and she discussed none of it, then or later. The smile in the Monte Carlo photographs does not change from year to year. Study that smile. It is the single most disciplined object in this entire story, and it was about to be tested by something no discipline covers. Because a marriage can survive scandal, indictment, and gunfire, and this one did. What it could not survive was a rival who sang. The bid arrived in the summer of 1959. It was carrying an opera singer. To understand what the summer of 1959 did to Tina Onassis, you first have to understand what Maria Callas was in 1959. She was not merely famous. She was the most celebrated soprano on earth, the fiercest name at La Scala and the Met, a Greek raised in New York, exactly like Tina, and utterly unlike her in every other way. Callas had fought for everything. Tina had been handed everything except a say. Onassis pursued Callas socially for months, the way he pursued anything he had decided to acquire. In July 1959, he landed the invitation he wanted. Maria Callas and her husband, an aging Italian industrialist named Giovanni Battista Meneghini, joined a 3-week cruise aboard the Christina, through the Mediterranean and the Aegean, and up the Bosphorus. Look at the passenger list for that cruise, because it is one of the strangest documents of the century. Sir Winston Churchill, 84 years old, with his wife Clementine and his canary. The Onassis children, 11 and 8. Tina, the hostess, 30 years old. And Maria Callas, 35, watching the ship's owner the way singers watch a conductor. What happened on that cruise has been narrated by nearly everyone who was aboard, except the 2 people it happened to. Meneghini later wrote about it with an abandoned husband's fury. The staff talked. The biographers assembled it. Somewhere between Portofino and Istanbul, Aristotle Onassis and Maria Callas crossed a line neither of them ever fully walked back. Trace the route, because the route itself was a seduction. Down the Italian coast in high summer, Portofino to Capri, the ship drawing crowds at every anchorage. Across to the Greek islands, where Onassis played sovereign in his own waters. Then through the Dardanelles to Istanbul, and on the Turkish leg he took Maria Callas to Smyrna, the city of his birth, the city that had burned around his family in 1922. He walked her through the streets of his own catastrophe. A man does not show a woman the ashes he came from as a courtesy. He shows her because he has decided she is going to matter. At the holy mountain of Athos, the crews paused for an audience with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who received Onassis and Callas together and blessed them as the world's greatest singer and the greatest seaman of the modern world. Meneghini would remember that blessing with bitterness for the rest of his life, and observers aboard marked it as the moment the affair stopped hiding. The two most famous Greeks alive, kneeling side by side under a blessing, while both their marriages stood on deck watching. And through all of it, an 84-year-old Winston Churchill sat wrapped on the sun deck, painting and dozing, the most photographed passenger of the voyage, his presence lending the whole floating arrangement the respectability of a state visit. Tina ran the hospitality of that ship, morning to midnight, for every day of those 3 weeks. Whatever she understood and whenever she understood it, she poured the drinks and made the tables laugh while it happened. There is a species of courage in that which nobody ever bothered to name, because it looked like manners. Tina did not need a biographer. She was on the ship. By several accounts, she came upon her husband and the singer in circumstances that ended the marriage in her mind well before any lawyer wrote a word. Whatever she saw or understood, she carried it off that boat in silence, and the silence is the point. She had been trained her whole life to keep the surface smooth. She kept it smooth now, while the fast set of Europe whispered across every terrace, from Monte Carlo to Athens. Onassis did not manage even the pretense. Within weeks of the cruise, he was seen with Callas in Milan, at Harry's bar in Venice, in the papers. Meneghini raged to journalists, and kept raging. The abandoned husband gave interviews for years, kept accounts of every slight, and eventually published his own memoir of the marriage, a book whose every page argues with a dead woman and a dead rival. History should be grateful for graceless men. They write everything down. The husbands and wives of 2 marriages burned in public, and the world took sides as if it were sport. Now watch what the 29-year-old does, because this is the first time in the entire story that Tina Livanos acts entirely on her own judgment, and she does it with a precision her father would have recognized. On the 25th of November, 1959, in New York, Tina filed for divorce. New York law in those days recognized one ground and one ground only: adultery. So she had to name someone. The world leaned in, expecting the scandal of the decade, the wife naming Maria Callas. She refused. Her petition named a correspondent identified as Mrs. J.R., an old friend from the Riviera set named Jean Rhinelander, and it accused her husband, in the filing's language reported at the time, of adultery on land and sea. Callas appears nowhere in the document. Sit with how deliberate that was. Naming Callas would have handed the singer a starring role in Tina's own humiliation and fed the newspapers for a decade. Naming a private woman from their own circle instead was surgical. It satisfied the law. It emptied the scandal of its prize. And it told Onassis, in the only language the family spoke fluently, that his wife knew how to negotiate too. A friend from that circle later summarized her thinking in one sentence that has attached itself to the case ever since. She would not give Callas the satisfaction. Her father watched the collapse with cold fury. Stavros Livanos was still alive in 1959, still keeping his ledgers, and the destruction of the Onassis marriage was, among everything else, the failure of his largest domestic investment. The old man's displeasure ran at both men. The son-in-law who had humiliated his daughter and the daughter's world that let it happen, and the family gatherings of that winter are described in the biographies as diplomatic events between states at the edge of recall. He had one daughter married to each rival. He now had one marriage burning in the world press, and another, Eugenia's, absorbing the vibrations next door. There was a press statement, brief and glacial, in which Tina said it was almost 13 years since her marriage, and that her husband knew the action was not taken lightly. Then she went quiet again. The lawyers did the rest. The New York action was eventually set aside in favor of something faster and cleaner, and in June 1960, in Alabama, where the residency rules were merciful, the marriage of Aristotle and Athina Onassis was dissolved on the ground of mental cruelty. The fairy tale of 1946 ended in a courtroom chosen for its speed. The 7 months between the filing and the decree were a war conducted entirely in tone. Onassis's side let it be known he wanted a reconciliation, and perhaps he did, in the way he wanted every asset that announced its departure. Emissaries went back and forth. Stavros Livanos, by the account of the biographers, pushed hard against a public trial in New York, because a contested adultery case meant witnesses, discovery, and a family ledger opened in a courtroom for the world's press. The old man had not spent 40 years keeping his name out of other people's files to watch his daughter's marriage become one. So the case moved, as these cases did, toward the quiet exits. Alabama in 1960 was the merciful jurisdiction of choice for the American rich, a state whose residency requirements could be satisfied with brief formalities, and whose courts asked few questions of consenting strangers. Mental cruelty was the courteous fiction on the paperwork, milder than adultery, kinder to everyone's lawyers. The woman who had refused to name Callas in November accepted, by June, a ground that named nothing at all. She had made her point the only time it mattered, in the filing the whole world read. Note what happened to the other marriage on that boat, because the symmetry is exact. In the same November of 1959 that Tina filed in New York, Maria Callas and Giovanni Battista Meneghini formalized their separation in Italy. 1 cruise, 3 weeks, 2 marriages dead within months of docking. Meneghini kept the villas and a grievance he published for decades. Callas kept Onassis, or believed she did. The only party to the summer of 1959 who walked away with both dignity and freedom was the 29-year-old everyone had described as the ornament. The children's arrangements were settled the way everything else was, privately and durably. Alexander and Christina would live substantially in their father's orbit, with their mother a presence across households and seasons. Modern readers flinch at that, and some contemporaries did too. But mark it in Tina's ledger honestly. She left the marriage. She was never accused, by anyone in the family's copious record, of leaving the children. The distinction is going to matter terribly. In 1973, she was 30 years old. She had spent 13 years, her entire adult life, as Mrs. Onassis. She left with a settlement the press guessed at and never confirmed, with her children shuttling between households, and with something no one had predicted: the public's quiet respect. Even the columnists who lived on Onassis gossip noted that the wife had walked out of the wreck with her chin level and her mouth shut. Onassis, for his part, told friends versions of the same line for years, that Tina was the one woman he should never have lost. He said it while installing Maria Callas in his life, so weigh it accordingly. With him, Even regret was a performance with an audience in mind. Here, the familiar story pauses, because the familiar story only ever cared about him. Follow the woman instead. She is about to marry into the most famous palace in England, hold the middle of this century's strangest triangle, and then make a decision that still stops historians mid-sentence. But before any of that, the war between the two brothers-in-law has to be understood properly, because while Tina's first marriage was dying in the newspapers, the machinery that had arranged it was grinding toward the island where her sister would be found dead. The feud between Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos is usually told as an anecdote of rich men racing yachts. That version is decoration. The real feud was total, decades long, and fought through fleets, governments, banks, and finally through the two sisters who had been married into it as instruments of balance. Start with the scale. Between them, by the late 1950s, the two men controlled tanker tonnage that placed them among the largest independent ship owners on Earth. When the Suez Crisis closed the canal in 1956 and freight rates went vertical, both fortunes compounded overnight. Oil moved on their hulls. Nations negotiated with them like sovereigns, and each measured every victory first against the other. The competition was cellular. When Onassis converted the Christina, Niarchos answered with the Creole, one of the most beautiful sailing yachts ever built, 3 masts of black hull and old master paintings. When Onassis leased the gaming concessions of Monte Carlo and made Monaco practically a subsidiary, Niarchos bought islands and estates and a ski resort's worth of St. Moritz. When one commissioned a supertanker, the other commissioned a longer one. Grown men, measuring in feet. It would be comic if it had stayed with objects. It did not. In 1954, when the United States government pursued Onassis over surplus ship dealings, Onassis believed to his bones that his brother-in-law had helped feed the fire. Whether he was right remains argued. What is documented is that the two men ran intelligence on each other, poached each other's people, litigated, and briefed the press against each other for decades, all while sharing a father-in-law, holidays, and eventually a graveyard's worth of grief. Stavros Livanos sat above the war like weather. The old man had placed a daughter with each rival, and the family gatherings that followed put the two combatants at one table, with the sisters between them. Eugenia and Tina were close, in the way of sisters who had been raised in the same beautiful isolation. Their closeness now had to route around a commercial war. Every christening was a negotiation. Every funeral, later, would be worse. And inside his own marriage, Stavros Niarchos was building the pattern that this story will not let go of. He married 5 times in his life. His third marriage, to Eugenia Livanos in 1947, produced 4 children and lasted, on paper, longer than any other. But in 1965, in an act that scandalized even that unshockable world, Niarchos divorced Eugenia to marry Charlotte Ford, the young daughter of Henry Ford II, in a Mexican ceremony, with Charlotte already pregnant. The Ford marriage was over within 2 years, and here the record produces one of those details that no novelist would risk. After the Mexican divorce from Charlotte Ford, Niarchos simply resumed his life with Eugenia. Under Greek law, as their circle understood it, his Mexican paperwork had never dissolved the Greek marriage at all. Eugenia had waited through the entire humiliation, the way the daughters of Stavros Livanos had been raised to wait, and she took him back without ever having legally lost him. Mark that. Eugenia absorbed public abandonment, a replacement wife, a child born to the replacement, and the return of the husband, all within about 2 years, and the world called the household restored. Whatever that household actually was by 1970, the women in this family had been schooled from birth to call it marriage. Put Eugenia's 23 years in one frame, because she is about to leave this story, and she deserves the frame. Her wedding had completed the father's great double placement, the second half of the pairing that armed both rivals at once. She gave the marriage 4 children, Philip, Spiros, Maria, and Constantine, and gave the household its entire climate. Guests across 2 decades describe the same woman, soft-voiced, formal, kind in a way that asked for nothing back. Her husband's establishment was among the grandest private operations in Europe, the Creole under sail, the St. Moritz villa in winter, the island in summer, and Eugenia moved through all of it like the one person on the payroll who had never seen the invoice. Her compensation was the position, and the position was the cage. When the Ford marriage came, she did not rage in any record we have. She waited. When it collapsed, she resumed. If you want a single measure of what the daughters of Stavros Livanos were built to withstand, it is this. Her husband's child by the woman who replaced her was born in May 1966, and within roughly 2 years, Eugenia was back at the head of his table, presiding over dinners as though the interruption had been weather. The men of this story broke countries against each other. The women absorbed the men. That was the division of labor, and nobody ever renegotiated it. Meanwhile, Tina, divorced and 31, had done the one thing nobody expected. She had married for something like normalcy. His name was John Spencer Churchill, the Marquis of Blandford, heir to the Duke of Marlborough and to Blenheim Palace, the vast Baroque pile where Winston Churchill had been born. They married in Paris on the 23rd of October, 1961. Tina became a marchioness, mistress in waiting of one of England's great houses, and stepped from the world of tanker manifests into the world of hunts and hedgerows. One detail here, small and strange, and worth 10 seconds. Her new husband's full name was John George Vanderbilt Henry Spencer Churchill. The Vanderbilt in the middle was no ornament. His grandmother was Consuelo Vanderbilt, the American railroad heiress, whose own mother had forced her, weeping, into marriage with a duke in 1895. Tina had married directly into the bloodline of the most famous coerced bride in American history. The house remembered. Houses like that always remember. By most accounts, the Blandford years were the quietest of Tina's adult life. English country mornings, horses, school terms. Friends described her as close to content. Look at what she had actually chosen, because the choice tells you what she was correcting for. The Marquis was not a tycoon. His fortune, by the standards of her first marriage, was a rounding error, an aristocrat's estate income against a shipowner's oceans. What he had instead was everything Onassis could never buy at any tonnage. A name older than the trade routes, a world where the season had rules, and the rules had centuries. Nobody in Oxfordshire was going to be indicted, shelled off Peru, or photographed with a soprano. After 13 years aboard the loudest fortune afloat, Tina Livanos had purchased, with her second marriage, the single commodity her first had never stocked: predictability. And there was the house behind the marriage. Blenheim Palace, the seat her husband stood heir to, was not merely grand. It was, for a woman of Tina's particular history, haunted in the most precise way imaginable. 66 years before Tina became Marchioness of Blandford, an American heiress named Consuelo Vanderbilt had been marched down an aisle toward that same dukedom, weeping behind her veil, sold by her mother for a title, in the most notorious arranged marriage of the Gilded Age. Consuelo's money had saved Blenheim. Her happiness had not survived it. Tina's own grandmother-in-law by marriage, in effect, was the most famous traded bride in American history, and Tina, traded at 17 by a father instead of a mother, now wore the courtesy title of that same house. If she ever remarked on the rhyme, the remark does not survive. Some rhymes do not need remarking. The English years gave her something else the record should credit: distance from the war. For the first time since 1946, she was not married to either army. She could receive her sister without an agenda, see her children without a negotiation, and read about her ex-husband's opera singer in the same spirit as everyone else at the breakfast table. Those who insist Tina's life was only tragedy have to skip these 6 or 7 years, and this film will not skip them. She had, for a while, something adjacent to peace. It is the only stretch of this story where nobody is buying anyone. But two forces kept reaching into the quiet. The first was her children, who were becoming casualties of the Onassis divorce in slow motion. Alexander, adrift between parents and measured constantly against his father, would grow into a young man who raced cars and airplanes as if trying to outrun the surname. Christina, plump and anxious, where her mother had been slight and polished, absorbed every headline about her family, like a child pressing on a bruise. The second force was Aristotle Onassis, who never released anything he had once owned. He kept Maria Callas for 9 years without marrying her, kept Tina informed of his affairs through the children and the papers, and kept building toward the acquisition that would detonate what remained of the family's privacy. On the 20th of October, 1968, on his island of Skorpios, Aristotle Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the President of the United States, the most photographed woman alive. The wedding stunned the world. Inside this family, it landed like ordnance. Maria Callas, discarded after 9 years, told the press that Jackie had done well to give her children a grandfather. Alexander, 20 years old, produced the line that biographers still reach for, that his father needed a wife but he had acquired a stepmother. And Tina, at Blenheim, watched the man she had married at 17 purchase the only bride on earth whose fame could make his first wife invisible. Whatever Jacqueline Kennedy was to Aristotle Onassis, to this story she is an eraser. From that Skorpios wedding onward, the world's memory of the name Onassis reorganized itself around Jackie, and the 17-year-old girl from 1946 began to disappear from her own life story. The disappearance was so complete that when Tina died 6 years later, some obituaries needed a paragraph to remind readers who she had been. She noticed. Friends from those years, quoted later, describe a woman who joked about it with a very still face. There is no record of what she said privately at Blenheim in October 1968. No letter survives that tells us. Where the record is silent, this film stays silent with it. What the record does show is the pace of what came next, and the pace is its own evidence. Within 24 months, the Blandford marriage was finished in all but paperwork. Within 19 months, Eugenia Livanos Niarchos would be dead on a private island. And within 36, Tina would stand in a Paris registry office and take, as her third husband, the man her sister's death had made a widower. But between the wedding on Skorpios and the night on Spetsopula stands one more piece of machinery, and it is the piece almost every telling of this story leaves out. To understand why 1970 in Greece bent the way it did, you have to understand who was paying for Greece. In April 1967, A group of colonels seized power in Athens, suspended parliamentary rule, and began running Greece as a garrison with a tourism board. The junta jailed and exiled its political enemies, censored its press, and faced, from its first morning, the problem every pariah government faces. It desperately needed money that did not ask questions. There were exactly 2 Greeks alive with money on that scale, and a lifelong habit of not asking questions of governments, and they hated each other. For Aristotle Onassis and Stavros Niarchos, the dictatorship was not a moral event. It was a procurement opportunity. Both men opened negotiations with the regime on industrial programs of enormous size, and the colonels, understanding exactly what they had, ran the 2 rivals against each other like bidders at an auction where the lot was the Greek economy itself. Onassis arrived with the grander scheme, a package of refinery, alumina, and power projects trumpeted in the hundreds of millions of dollars. A program with an imperial name, Omega, Niarchos, characteristically, arrived already owning things. His Aspropyrgos refinery had been processing the country's oil since the 1950s, and his position was the quieter one of the incumbent who intends to remain. Follow what this meant beneath the surface. Through the very years we are approaching, the years of the island file, both brothers-in-law were locked in simultaneous, competing, high-stakes negotiations with the military government of Greece. Each man represented investment the regime could not afford to lose. Each man's goodwill was, to the colonels, a strategic asset. Neither man could be casually embarrassed by Greek institutions without a cost the regime would have to calculate. Hold that thought gently. It proves no particular thing about any particular file. But when, in a moment, you watch Greek justice weigh a case that touches Stavros Niarchos, you are entitled to remember that the scales stood in a country whose government was, at that exact hour, soliciting him. The pressure does not tell you the answer the system gave was wrong. It tells you the system was answering under load, and every honest account of this case has said the same. The Omega program, for the record, went the way of many grand junta schemes, announced hugely, renegotiated endlessly, and collapsed within a few years, leaving the colonels and Onassis blaming each other, while Niarchos consolidated what he already held. The auction, like every other contest between the 2 men, ended with both claiming victory, and neither finished with the other. And while the husbands bid for a dictatorship, the wives' side of the family was thinning. Tina's marriage to Blandford was dissolving by degrees into friendly separateness, an English arrangement in which nothing is announced and everything is understood. She wintered at St. Moritz, where the Niarchos establishment anchored the season, and the resort's small world put her and her sister's household in the same rooms, at the same tables, through the same long white months. Eugenia presided at the villa as she presided everywhere, gently, correctly, and with whatever it cost her, folded out of sight. Friends from those seasons would later be mined by biographers for omens, and would produce mostly small things. Eugenia, quieter than usual. The pill bottles nobody counted, because everybody had them. A marriage running on protocol. In a family where the surface was the entire visible product, nobody was trained to read what was underneath, and so nobody did. The chessboard was about to lose both queens. Spetsopoula is a small island off the eastern coast of the Peloponnese, a short run by fast boat from the harbor at Piraeus. Stavros Niarchos bought it in the 1950s and built it into something between an estate and a principality. A great house above the water, a chapel, a harbor for the Creole, pheasants imported for the shooting, gamekeepers to raise them, staff enough to run a village, and around all of it the sea, which is the oldest wall there is. Guests remembered the island as beautiful and strangely quiet. Niarchos ran it the way he ran his fleet, with schedules and standards and a cold perfection that made even holidays feel administered. This was the kingdom Eugenia Livanos had presided over for more than 2 decades, through 4 children, through the Ford humiliation, through the restoration that followed. If she had an opinion about the price of presiding over it, she kept it where the women of her family kept everything. By the spring of 1970, Eugenia was 43 years old. Those who saw her in the last years describe a gentle, reserved woman, thinner than she had been, running on nerves and cigarettes, and the pharmaceutical arithmetic that held together a great many women of her class in those years. The pills had names that sound almost domestic now. Seconal for sleep, something else for the morning. The bottles sat on bedside tables from Athens to St. Moritz, prescribed, refilled, and nobody's business. On the night of the 3rd of May, 1970, Eugenia and Stavros Niarchos were on Spetsopoula, and by every account that survives, the evening curdled into a quarrel. About what, exactly? Depends on who is telling it, and every teller has an interest. What is agreed is that the household heard the marriage that night, raised voices in the private wing, a bad hour in a house built to muffle bad hours. Sometime before midnight, Eugenia Niarchos took a quantity of Seconal. The number that would enter the record was 25 tablets. Be precise about what that number means, because the whole case turns on it. Seconal was the trade name of secobarbital, one of the strong barbiturates that the era prescribed for sleep, with a generosity that horrifies modern medicine. 1 tablet put an adult under. A handful was dangerous. 25 was not a miscount or a bad night's fumbling. 25 was a decision, or a state of mind so far past caution that the distinction stops mattering. Every doctor who later touched this file understood that arithmetic instantly, and so did every prosecutor. The question the arithmetic could not answer was the only one that mattered. What happens around a woman in the hours before she arrives at such a number? A locked island, a private staff, a quarreling household, and a bottle. The pills could tell the pathologists what killed her. They could never tell anyone what the last hours were like, and the one witness who could was the husband. What happened in the hours that followed is the entire question, and this film will give you only what the record gives. Niarchos would state that he found his wife unresponsive, that he tried desperately to revive her, that he slapped her, shook her, pressed on her chest, forced coffee into her, did everything a frightened man does in the minutes when a body will not answer. A doctor was summoned from the mainland. The distances that made the island private now made it slow. By the time medical help reached Spetsopoula, there was nothing left to do. Walk the geography of that night, because the geography is evidence of a kind. Spetsopoula sits off the far tip of the Argolic coast. A fast launches run from the mainland harbors, and a serious journey from any hospital worth the name. That remoteness was the island's entire product. It kept out photographers, creditors, prosecutors, and history, and on the night of the 3rd of May, it kept out medicine with exactly the same efficiency. A woman in barbiturate collapse on a city street in Athens had a chance. The same woman in a mansion behind 3 miles of private water had a countdown. The rich had built themselves places beyond the reach of the world, and the world's reach is sometimes the thing that saves your life. The household staff of that night, the stewards and maids and boat crews, were interviewed by the magistrates in the months that followed, and their testimony shaped the file in ways the public record only glimpses. None of them ever gave a newspaper interview worth the name, that decade or later. Whatever the servants of Spetsopoula saw and heard, they placed it into the file and closed their mouths, and the file went where files go. Staff silence was a condition of employment in that world. It was also, for historians, the sealing of the only independent windows into the house. In the first hours of the 4th of May, 1970, Eugenia Livanos Niarchos was pronounced dead. She was the first of the two sisters. She had been married to the man of the house, in law or in fact, for 23 years. The announcement that went out spoke of a heart attack. That was the first version. It lasted about as long as it took the body to reach the pathologists. The autopsy told a different story from the announcement, and the difference is where this case truly begins. The medical examination found death from an overdose of barbiturates, consistent with the 25 Seconal tablets. That alone would have made the death a tragedy instead of a scandal. Wealthy women died of quiet overdoses in that decade with terrible regularity, and the world had learned to file such deaths under exhaustion and look away. But the examiners found something else. The body of Eugenia Niarchos carried fresh bruises. The reports described injuries to the eye, to the neck, to the abdomen, marks recent enough to have been made in her final hours. And with that finding, the file stopped being a private grief and became a public question aimed at one of the most powerful men in Greece. The world press arrived within a news cycle and never really left. The American magazines filed the story under a heading that stuck to it permanently: the Spetsopoula incident, a phrase with the cadence of a spy novel and the circulation of one too. Reporters chartered boats to circle the island. Photographs of the Creole at anchor ran beside file pictures of Eugenia in her jewels, and the captions asked in 6 languages the question the editors could not print as a sentence. The family issued nothing. The regime's censored Greek papers handled the story with tongs. Abroad, nobody had tongs. Understand also the custom the announcement was leaning on, because it almost worked. In that era, when a woman of position died of pills, the machinery of discretion engaged automatically. Sympathetic doctors wrote cardiac language on certificates. Coroners in half the capitals of Europe accepted a family's framing as a courtesy. The press printed the euphemism and moved on. It was a system, unwritten and universal, for keeping the bedrooms of the rich out of the public record, and it had buried 1,000 quiet overdoses under 1,000 heart attacks. What broke the system this time was jurisdiction and luck. The death had occurred on Greek soil. The Greek examiners did their work properly, and the findings could not be gentled into cardiology. For once, the machinery of discretion jammed. Notice what the first announcement had done to the family's credibility, because it poisoned everything after. A heart attack had been announced. The autopsy said barbiturates. When a household's first official sentence about a death is wrong, every later sentence pays interest on it, fairly or not. The lawyers knew it. The press knew it. And 30 miles away in Athens, the men reading the file knew it best of all. Ask the question plainly, because the prosecutors had to. A woman swallows a fatal dose of sleeping pills after a quarrel. Her body shows fresh bruising. Her husband says the bruises are his rescue attempt, the desperate handling of a man trying to slap and shake and pound a dying wife back to life. Is that the mark of violence before the pills, or the mark of panic after them? Both readings fit the same photographs. That is the uncomfortable heart of this file, and it is why honest people have disagreed about it for half a century. Greece, in 1970, was ruled by a military junta, and the case put the regime in an impossible spot. Stavros Niarchos was not merely rich. He was one of the 2 or 3 most consequential private economic actors in the country, a man the government was actively courting for investment. A colonel's regime that jailed poets now had on its desk a file that touched a man who could move shipyards. Every step the Greek justice system took next would be read twice, once as law and once as politics. That does not tell you the outcome was corrupt. It tells you the outcome would never be allowed to look simple. The district authorities opened an investigation. The body was examined, and the questions sharpened rather than settled. The press, Greek and foreign, went into a frenzy that the family's lawyers could not contain, because the elements were irresistible. A private island, a locked circle of staff, 25 tablets, bruises, and standing over all of it, a widower whose name had spent 20 years in the same sentence as the word ruthless. Tina was in this storm from its first hour, and her position was unlike anyone else's on earth. The dead woman was her sister. The suspect, if the file hardened into charges, was her brother-in-law twice over, the rival of one ex-husband, the neighbor of her whole life. The Livanos family closed around the case in total silence. The patriarch was beyond comment, for Stavros Livanos had died in Lausanne 7 years earlier, and the silence now belonged to his widow Arietta and to the heir, George. None of them spoke. Whatever was said in private between the family and Niarchos in those weeks, no reliable record of it survives, and this film will not invent one. Eugenia was buried, and the file stayed open. Through the summer and autumn of 1970, examining magistrates worked through the island's staff, the medical findings, the timeline of that night, the pharmacology of Seconal, the physics of bruising, and in December 1970, the Piraeus public prosecutor, a man named Constantine Fafoutis, reached the conclusion that detonated across every front page in Europe. The prosecutor's recommendation was precise, and precision matters here more than anywhere else in this story, so listen to exactly what was and was not said. Fafoutis recommended that Stavros Niarchos be charged under Article 311 of the Greek Penal Code, causing bodily injuries that resulted in death, not murder, not a claim that Niarchos had set out to kill his wife. The theory contained in that article was narrower and colder, that in the quarrel on the night of the 3rd of May, injuries were inflicted, and that those injuries, together with what followed, ended in a death the man had not necessarily intended but had caused. The nearest concept in American or English law is involuntary homicide. For a moment in the winter of 1970, the impossible seemed to be actually happening. One of the richest men alive stood one signature away from a criminal trial over the death of his wife on his own island. Understand the machine the file was moving through, because Greek procedure is where this case was decided. In that system, an examining magistrate assembles the evidence, and a prosecutor argues what should be done with it, but neither of them sends a man to trial. That decision belongs to a judicial council, a panel of judges who weigh the assembled file in chambers, out of public view, and rule whether the accusation stands. No jury hears it. No witness is cross-examined in the open. The most consequential Greek criminal question of the decade would be answered by a handful of judges reading paper, in a country where judges served at the pleasure of colonels. Inside that paper, a war of experts had been running for months. The medical findings were mapped and remapped. How old was each bruise? What force makes such a mark? Can a frantic resuscitation, the slapping and shaking and chest pressure the husband described, print itself on a body in exactly these places. The professors consulted did not fully agree, and their disagreement is preserved in the reporting of the time. When experts disagree inside a closed file, the benefit flows to the accused. That is not corruption. That is how the doubt is supposed to work, everywhere. And one man followed the file with an attention the biographers all record: Aristotle Onassis. His enemy of 30 years stood at the edge of a criminal courtroom over the death of a Livanos daughter, and Onassis, by several accounts, could speak of little else that winter. Whatever he hoped the file would do, the file declined to do it. Now watch the machinery work, and count with me, because the numbers here are the story. The examining process around Eugenia's death ultimately involved not one examination of the body, but repeated forensic review. The bruises were measured, mapped, dated, and argued over by experts in the pay of no one, and experts in the pay of everyone. The defense position was consistent throughout, that every mark on Eugenia Niarchos was the signature of rescue, the slaps and compressions and desperate handling of a man fighting for his wife's life, and that the only killer on the island that night came out of a pill bottle. And there was a document Eugenia had left writing behind, described in the reporting of the time as a note in her own hand, affectionate toward her husband, the kind of message that reads as farewell. Its exact wording has been published in varying forms, and this film will not pretend to certainty about it. But its existence entered the file, and a note in the dead woman's hand pointed the law toward one word: suicide, or at the very least, her own hand and no one else's. Consider, for one honest moment, what a trial would have meant, because everyone in Athens was considering it. The richest defendant in Greek history, in the dock of a country his investments were propping up. The staff of Spetsopoula, under oath, one by one. The pathologists cross-examined about every bruise in open court, with the world press filling the benches, and the regime's ministers reading transcripts each evening. It would have been the most scrutinized proceeding in the country's modern history, whatever verdict it returned. A conviction was unthinkable, and an acquittal would look purchased. For a dictatorship, courting respectability and investment at once, the only good trial was no trial. None of which, and this must be said with equal force, proves the eventual decision wrong on the law. Files with disputed forensics, a documented overdose, a farewell note, and a consistent rescue account fail to reach trial in London and New York too, under governments nobody accuses. The political shadow explains why the decision would never be trusted. It does not by itself convict the decision. Hold that distinction. Almost nobody at the time managed to. The Judicial Council that reviewed the prosecutor's recommendation weighed the theory of injury against the pharmacological findings, the note, and the rescue explanation. Early in 1971, it declined to send Stavros Niarchos to trial. The inquiry's conclusion accepted that the cause of death was the barbiturates, and it accepted that the bruises were consistent with attempts at revival. The case was closed. The man was cleared. Say the finding plainly, because fairness demands it, and so does the law. Stavros Niarchos was investigated by the justice system of his country and exonerated. No court ever found him responsible for Eugenia's death. Nothing you will hear in the rest of this film disputes that ruling, and anyone who tells this story as a settled murder is telling you something the record does not say. But hold, beside that clean legal sentence, the things the record also says and cannot unsay, that the death was not a heart attack, though a heart attack was announced, that the body was bruised, whatever the cause of the bruising, that the prosecutor who read the whole file a career official with nothing to gain, believed it added up to a charge, that the review which ended the case took place under a dictatorship with every reason to keep Greece's largest private investors serene, and that the only other adult in that story, the woman who swallowed the tablets, was never able to answer a single question. Both true things stand there together. He was cleared, and the file was never simple. This film holds both, because the record holds both. The world moved on with unseemly speed, as the world does. Niarchos withdrew into his fleets and his paintings. The junta got its investments. The press found new scandals. And in the Livanos family, the surviving daughter did something that turned every eye in Europe back toward that island, and has kept historians arguing from that day to this. The Blandford marriage had been quietly dying since before Eugenia's death, and in the spring of 1971, it was formally ended. The Marquess and his Marchioness divorced without spectacle, the way that class prefers. Tina kept the friendships, the houses in her orbit, and her composure. She was 42 years old, twice divorced, and by the standards of her set, free for the first time in her life. Her father had been 8 years in his grave in Lausanne. Her sister had been 1 year in hers. Her children were grown and struggling with the surname their father had made planetary. What she did with that freedom, almost no one saw coming. On the 21st of October, 1971, in Paris, Athina Livanos married Stavros Niarchos, the widower of her sister, the man from the island, the lifelong enemy of her first husband. The ceremony was small, quick, and private, conducted while most of the world's press had no idea it was happening. There was no cathedral this time, no orchids, no exiled royalty filling a Manhattan nave. A registry formality, a handful of witnesses, and a communique after the fact. The bride, who had been given the wedding of 1946, took her third husband the way one signs for a delivery. 17 months and 17 days after Eugenia was pronounced dead on Spetsapula, her younger sister took her place as the 5th Mrs. Niarchos. When the news broke, the wire services treated it as scarcely believable, and said so in copy that still reads stunned. The society columns reached for, and mostly failed to find precedent. Widowers had always married their dead wives' sisters, in older centuries, in ordinary families, for children and for farms. But there was no precedent for this file. No one could name another case where the sister arriving had watched the sister departing pass through an autopsy room and a prosecutor's docket on her way out. The reaction inside her own family was not debate. It was rupture. Alexander Onassis, 23 years old, learned of his mother's wedding and refused to accept it in any form. The accounts from the Onassis side describe something close to a formal breach. A son treating his mother's marriage as a betrayal of his dead aunt, and of sense itself. Christina had already broken 3 months earlier, and the timing tells you the relationship with Niarchos was no secret inside the family long before Paris. In July 1971, 20 years old and in open flight from everything her name meant, she married Joseph Bolker in a Las Vegas civil ceremony. Bolker was a Los Angeles real estate man, 47, divorced, with 4 daughters, and entirely unsuitable by every metric her father owned. Onassis went to war on the marriage, with trust fund ultimatums and relentless pressure, and it was dissolved inside a year. Those who knew Christina connected her Las Vegas sprint to the news gathering around her mother, that summer the way you connect a flinch to a blow. In one family, in one 4-month window, the daughter eloped to spite the father, and the mother married the enemy to spite, perhaps, the entire century. Neither woman ever explained herself. In this family, explanation was overhead, and there is one question about the marriage that every biographer eventually reaches, and every reader should sit with for a moment. Spetsopoula did not go anywhere. The island remained the crown of the Niarchos establishment, its harbor, its chapel, its house with the private wing. The new Mrs. Niarchos would live her married life in residences that included the very rooms her sister's file described. Whether Tina walked those rooms often, seldom, or never, no guest ever reliably reported, and no record resolves. It is the kind of detail history loses precisely because everyone present found it unbearable to mention. The file simply notes the address. Imagination has to stop at the door, and this film stops with it. And Aristotle Onassis, his first wife, had just married his oldest enemy. The chessboard he had played against Niarchos for 30 years now had Tina on the far side of it. People around him described cold fury, and something underneath the fury that none of them could quite name. The two men now shared more than a father-in-law and a feud. They shared, in every sense that mattered to either of them, a family. Why did she do it? You have to ask. Because everyone asked, and you have to be honest about the answer, which is that the record does not contain one. Tina never explained herself in any surviving interview or letter this film could stand behind. What survives is speculation from her circle, and it splits three ways. Some said comfort, that the two bereaved households had leaned on each other after Eugenia died, that grief had simply curdled into attachment between two people who had known each other for a quarter of a century. Some said arithmetic, that the marriage stitched the Livanos' inheritance and the Niarchos fleet back into a single estate, with Eugenia's 4 children on one side of it and the Livanos' legacy on the other, that this family had always merged by wedding and was merging one last time. And some said the simplest, saddest thing, that Athina Livanos had spent her whole life being placed beside powerful men, and when the last placement offered itself, she did not know another way to live. The other principals arranged their faces and their paperwork. The Marquis of Blandford behaved throughout with the discretion his class is bred for, said nothing sharp in public then, or ever, and within the following year had quietly remarried within his own world. In the Livanos family, the two people whose blessing would have meant most were differently silent. Arietta, the matriarch, made no public statement her biographers can produce. George, the brother who now carried the house, made none either. Silence in that family was never absence of opinion. It was the safe in which opinion was kept. As for Aristotle Onassis, those around him report that the news reached him like a market event, something to be analyzed for exposure. His first wife inside his enemy's walls meant his children's inheritance rubbing hulls with the Niarchos estate. His family grief now legally adjacent to the Spetsopoula file, and his oldest hatred seated at Christmas. The two men had spent 30 years building separate everything, separate fleets, separate islands, separate mythologies. One registry office in Paris had just merged the one asset class neither of them could liquidate: the past. Comfort, arithmetic, or habit. The record refuses to choose, and so will this film. But it will show you one photograph in words. A Paris registry office in October. A bride of 42 in a plain, elegant suit. A groom of 62, cleared by a judicial council 8 months earlier. And nowhere in the frame the 2 children who had stopped speaking to her, or the sister whose place at the table she was about to occupy every night for the rest of her life. Whatever the marriage was, it now had 3 years to run. and the family it had shocked was about to be dismantled, one member at a time, in an order no novelist would dare. Alexander Onassis spent the last year of his mother's marriage refusing to enter any house that contained Stavros Niarchos. The breach between mother and son was not theatrical. It was administrative, which in this family was the more serious kind. Visits routed around holidays, messages through lawyers and secretaries, a 24-year-old heir, with his father's stubbornness and his mother's wounded reserve, waiting for one of the adults to blink first. There was not going to be time. Alexander had grown into the only person in the Onassis empire who told its owner the truth. He ran the airline interests his father had acquired, argued against the old man's excesses to his face, and had fallen durably in love with Fiona Thiessen, a woman 16 years his senior, a relationship his father opposed with characteristic totality. Those who worked with Alexander in his last year describe a young man methodically becoming his own person, one refusal at a time. He hated the seaplane his father kept for hopping between the mainland and the islands. He called it dangerous. He had been trying to retire it for months. On the 22nd of January 1973, that seaplane, a Piaggio amphibian, took off from Athens airport with Alexander aboard to check out a new pilot. It was in the air for about 15 seconds. The controls had been misrigged. The aircraft banked, caught, and went into the runway from barely 100 feet. The two pilots survived. Alexander's head injuries were beyond every surgery that money could summon, and his father summoned all of it, flying in specialists from London and Boston overnight. The vigil at the Athens hospital drew the whole broken map of this family into one corridor. Onassis and Jacqueline flew in. Christina came, Fiona Thiessen, the woman Alexander loved and his father had fought, sat with the family that had refused her. The surgeons had been assembled from 2 continents overnight, and they told the assembled fortune what fortunes hate most, that there was nothing to buy. The brain was gone. Only the machines were living. It made no difference that his father offered the world for a miracle. On the 23rd of January, 1973, the machines were stopped, and the heir to the Onassis fortune was dead at 24. The investigations that followed were brutally specific. The Greek Air Force inquiry, and later a private investigator Onassis hired himself, an Englishman named Alan Hunter, reached the same finding. During the installation of a new control column, the aileron connecting cables had been fitted in reverse. The pilot banked one way, and the aircraft answered with the other. 15 seconds of flight had been enough to make the error unrecoverable. It was negligence, ordinary, procedural, human negligence, the kind that kills people without ever meaning anything. Grief did not soften this family. It detonated what remained of it. Aristotle Onassis refused the word negligence with every cell in his body, because negligence meant the universe had killed his son for no reason, and he could not live in that universe. He told intimates that enemies had murdered the boy, and among the enemies his mind reached for, by several biographers' accounts, was the name Niarchos. No evidence of any such thing was ever found, then or since. The old man never stopped looking. He kept his son's body embalmed for weeks while he argued about where and how a dynasty buries its future, and finally laid him on Skorpios, beside the chapel where he had married Jacqueline Kennedy 4 years earlier, and Tina. Her son had died with the breach between them unhealed. Whatever passed between mother and child in their last encounters, no letter survives. No interview records it, and the people who might have known kept it to themselves. This film will not manufacture a deathbed reconciliation. the record cannot show. What the record shows is a mother at a funeral on her first husband's island, standing in the family she had left, married to the man her dead son could not forgive her for marrying. Those who saw Tina in the months after January 1973 describe a woman who began, quietly and politely, to close the shutters. The public appearances thinned. The friendships went to letters, then to silence. Her health, long propped on the same bedside pharmacology that had run through her sister's file, worsened in ways her circle spoke of only in euphemism. The euphemisms of that class are their own dialect. Tired, fragile, resting. She had 18 months left. The marriage that had scandalized Europe settled, in its final stretch, into something almost invisible. Stavros and Tina Niarchos moved between St. Moritz and Paris and the sea, hosting less, photographed less, mentioned less. Some around them insisted the marriage was genuinely tender, that the two of them, both bereaved twice over, had found a kind of peace inside the fortress of staff and schedules. Others describe a household of separate floors and separate hours, a woman medicated through her days, and a husband administering an empire that no longer amused him. Both versions come from interested parties, the truth kept to itself. What can be documented is subtraction. In 4 years, Tina had lost her sister, then her son, then the last working connection to her daughter. Christina was now careening through the wreckage of her own young life. A marriage made and unmade at speed, an overdose scare in London in the summer of 1974 that the family contained the way it contained everything, with clinics and denials. Mother and daughter, each unraveling on her own side of a locked door, each described by friends as desperate about the other and unable to say so across the breach. Whether Tina and her first husband ever truly spoke again after their son's funeral, the biographies disagree, and this film leaves that line where the record leaves it, dead. What is documented is that the two of them spent 1974 dying in parallel, in the same city much of the time, a few arrondissements apart, each sealed inside a separate marriage to a separate silence. Paris, that year, held the entire wreckage of 1946 within a taxi ride. Nobody took the ride. Aristotle Onassis, meanwhile, was dying in public. The death of Alexander had broken something structural in him. That same stretch saw him negotiating the surrender of Olympic Airways back to the Greek state, the national airline he had run for years as a personal flag. The man who had spent 3 decades acquiring was now, for the first time in his adult life, handing things back, and those who dealt with him at the table said the fight had simply gone out of the numbers. Within months, he began showing the symptoms of myasthenia gravis, the muscle disease that would droop his eyelids until he taped them open behind dark glasses, a detail the paparazzi recorded with their usual mercy. The marriage to Jacqueline had long since become a negotiation, conducted through lawyers and seating charts. The empire was being reorganized around a hole where a son had been. People who dealt with him in 1974 describe a man running on rage and habit. One document from that January survives to show exactly where his mind had settled, aboard his own aircraft, on a long flight to Acapulco with Jacqueline seated nearby. Aristotle Onassis took a pad and wrote out his last will in his own hand, in the form Greek law recognized for wills of that kind. Page after page in his own script, at altitude, dividing the world he had built, half the fortune to Christina, half to a foundation that would carry Alexander's name forever. To his wife, a settlement designed to be final, and to invite no appetite for more. A man writes his will by hand at 30,000 feet when he has stopped believing in time. He had 14 months of it left. The pad went back into the briefcase, and the plane flew on toward the sun. And in that same season, the first Mrs. Onassis and the last one existed for each other only as columns in other people's newspapers. There is no record that Tina and Jacqueline ever exchanged a private word in the final years, nothing beyond the formal adjacency of two women who had held the same title and paid different prices for it. The century's most examined marriage web ended as it had lived, with the women kept in separate rooms. Keep all three of them in frame at once, because this is the last time the triangle exists. The husband of 1946, taped together and raging on his island. The bride of 1946, sedated behind Paris curtains. And between them the rival, now brother-in-law, now husband, older than both of his dead wives' worst memories of him, still buying paintings. The world that had once fought for invitations to their tables was learning to speak of all three in the past tense while they lived. The Monte Carlo years were a generation gone. The great cruises had stopped. Even the feud was mostly memory now, an institution maintained by lawyers out of habit, like a church with no congregation. What remained active in the whole shining machine was the one component nobody had ever serviced, the grief. And in the autumn of 1974, it was running 3 households at once. Her last seasons ran on the old calendar, with the old discipline. A final winter at St. Moritz, where the villa that had been Eugenia's kingdom now answered to her. An arrangement whose daily weight no outsider can calculate, and this film will not pretend to. A spring and summer in Paris. Mother and daughter circled each other that year through intermediaries and brief encounters, each reportedly frantic about the other and neither able to cross the distance. 2 women signaling across a canyon the family had spent decades digging. There was no reconciliation scene. Real families rarely get one. There was just less and less time, and neither of them knew it. In the first week of October 1974, Tina and Stavros Niarchos were in residence at the Hôtel des Chanelez, the 18th-century mansion in the 7th arrondissement of Paris that served as one of their principal homes. Tina was 45 years old. Those who saw her that autumn describe her as thin, listless, polite, and far away. On the evening of the 9th of October, she retired to her room in the ordinary way of that extraordinary house. Sometime in the hours that followed, in a bedroom, a staff of dozens stood ready to serve. The second daughter of Stavros Livanos stopped breathing, and nobody knew. The maid found her in the morning of the 10th of October, 1974. The first announcement from the household said, as the first announcement always said in this family, heart attack. A 45-year-old woman, a sudden cardiac event, a private tragedy, condolences appreciated, no questions taken. Stavros Niarchos issued no personal statement the record preserves, then or afterward. Twice widowed now, both times of Livanos sisters, both times in his own houses, he handled the second death as he had handled the first, through staff, through lawyers, and through silence. You have heard that sentence before in this film. So had Christina Onassis. Christina was 23 years old, and in the space of 21 months, she had lost her brother to a crash the family called sabotage, watched her father begin to die, survived her own August, and now been told that her mother had died of a heart attack in a house belonging to Stavros Niarchos. Whatever else can be said of Christina and her own tragedy will need saying before this film ends. On the 10th of October, she did the single hardest thing anyone in this story ever did. She refused the family sentence. Christina demanded an autopsy on her own mother, over the objections implicit in every wall of that world. The demand was reported at the time in plain terms. A daughter asking the French authorities to establish how her mother had actually died, in the house of the man whose last wife's death had produced a criminal file. The inference sat in every newsroom in Europe, and nobody had to print it to make it heard. Note what her demand actually accomplished inside the French system, because the system was not built to welcome it. France attaches no automatic public inquest to a private death in a private house. Had the household's first account stood unchallenged, the certificate could have carried its cardiac courtesy into the registry, and the file would have closed by the weekend, one more discreet ending in the 7th arrondissement. It took the dead woman's daughter, publicly, against the grain of two families' instincts, to force the question into a mortuary and onto paper. Whatever else history says about Christina Onassis, it must say this: in a dynasty that managed every death, she is the only member who ever demanded that one be examined. The autopsy was performed. The finding, announced within days, was acute edema of the lung, fluid in the lungs, a way of describing a final mechanism rather than a full story, consistent, the physicians of the era noted, with the pharmacology that had shadowed her for years. The French authorities ruled the death accidental. No evidence of violence was found. No file was opened against anyone. Whatever killed Tina Niarchos worked from the inside, from grief and chemistry, and the law, having asked its one question, closed the folder. Say this one plainly too, because the pattern will tempt you past the record, and the record must hold. Two sisters died in the houses of Stavros Niarchos, 4 years apart. In the first case, prosecutors sought a charge, and the courts refused it and cleared the man. In the second case, the examination found an accident and accused no one. That is the entire legal truth of both files. There is no third file. Anyone who tells you the pattern proves something is selling you a certainty that two justice systems, asked directly, declined to provide. But a pattern does not need a verdict to be a wound, and the wound is what followed. The burial was as quiet as the wedding 3 years earlier had been, and quieter than any event in her first marriage had ever been allowed to be. The reports describe a small gathering, family black, Swiss weather, no eulogies released to the press. The paparazzi who had chased the Christina across the Mediterranean for a decade barely staffed it. The circulation numbers had moved on to the widow in New York and the dying man on the island, and a funeral for a first wife did not sell papers in 1974. She had been the most photographed hostess in Europe. Cameras could not find the interest to watch her buried. They buried Athina Livanos Onassis Blandford Niarchos at the Bois de Vaux Cemetery in Lausanne. Not on an island, not in a palace chapel. In the Swiss ground her father had chosen a decade earlier, beside her sister. Stavros Livanos, the man who had traded both daughters into the war of the century, now lay a few steps from both of its casualties. The fleet builder and his 2 receipts, reunited under Lausanne reign, while the 2 husbands they had been traded between went on breathing for a little while longer. From the Onassis side, the reports describe a man staggered by the news out of Paris, in a way that surprised even his intimates. Whatever Aristotle Onassis had made of his first wife's last marriage, her death subtracted one of the few living witnesses to the years when his legend was still a family. Those around him in that final winter describe grief running under the rage, unspoken, in the way of men who have run out of people to perform for. Christina stood at that grave, having effectively lost, in under 2 years, brother, mother, and the version of her father that could still be reached. 5 months later, the rest of him followed. Aristotle Onassis died in the American Hospital of Paris on the 15th of March, 1975, at 69, of respiratory failure after surgery, with his daughter nearby and his wife arriving from New York. He was buried on Skorpios beside Alexander. The obituaries ran his life at full spread. The tankers, Monte Carlo, Callas, Jacqueline. In paragraph after paragraph across the world's front pages, the girl he married in 1946 appeared as a clause. The first wife, Tina, who died last year. A clause. 28 years of the story, reduced to a subordinate clause in her ex-husband's obituary. If you want to know what this film means by erasure, it means that sentence. Death did not end the war between the houses. It just changed the currency. Consider first what Tina left behind in law. Her death at 45, intestate rumor said at first, then settled by lawyers as everything in that world is settled, moved a substantial Livanos fortune one more step along the path her marriages had drawn. Reports at the time and biographies since put her personal estate in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and the principal heir was the daughter who had demanded her autopsy. Christina Onassis, at 23, now stood to inherit from her mother, and within 5 months, from her father, the better part of 2 of the great fortunes of the century. Watch what that inheritance actually was, though. It was a fleet with a hole where Alexander should have stood. It was an island with 2 graves on it. It was a stepmother in New York with lawyers. A settlement eventually reported at roughly $26 million to close Jacqueline's claims against the estate. It was the Livanos discipline, the Onassis appetite, and the accumulated grief of both, wired into one exhausted young woman who had never been allowed an ordinary year. 2 documents from those months deserve their own light. The first is the will Aristotle Onassis left, which did something no one expected. It split the empire, half to Christina and half to a foundation created in the name of his dead son, so that the fortune built on the 1946 wedding now partly belongs, forever, to the memory of the boy that wedding produced. The Alexander Onassis Foundation stands today, funding hospitals and scholarships, a philanthropic monument with a seaplane crash at the bottom of it. The second document is stranger and sadder. In December 1974, 2 months after Tina's funeral, and 3 months before his own death, Aristotle Onassis took out paid advertisements offering a reward of $1 million for proof that his son's crash had been deliberate rather than negligent. A dying man, spending a fortune to purchase a murderer, because a murderer would at least mean the death had an author. The reward found nothing, because there was nothing to find. He had outlived his son by 26 months, his first wife by 5, and his own capacity to accept the shape of either loss by longer than that. Christina ran the empire better than the world expected, which the world found surprising, because the world had only ever looked at her weight and her marriages. The marriages themselves read like a woman searching the entire map for one exit. The Las Vegas real estate man at 20, a Greek banking heir at 24, gone within 14 months. Then, most astonishing of all, a Soviet shipping official named Sergei Kausov, and for a stretch of 1978, the richest young woman in the Western world was living as a wife in a modest Moscow apartment, watched by every intelligence service with a filing cabinet, an heiress trying on the one life her money could not follow her into. It did not last either. Finally, the French pharmaceutical heir, Thierry Roussel, and in 1985, a daughter, Athina, named by the old rules for a grandmother the child would never meet. It was the one uncomplicated joy the record shows her. On the 19th of November, 1988, Christina Onassis was found dead in a bathtub in Buenos Aires at 37 years old. The examination found no violence, no note, nothing but a heart that had been asked for too much for too long. The finding on the certificate was acute pulmonary edema. If that phrase sounds familiar, it is because you heard it 14 years earlier, in a bedroom in Paris. The daughter's file closed with the same words as the mother's. 3 women of one family, 1970, 1974, 1988, an island, a mansion, a bathtub, a prosecutor's file, an accident ruling, a heart ruling. Every death examined, every death closed. No person ever convicted of anything. The record is consistent, and the record is merciless, and the two are not in conflict. Wealth of that altitude does not protect its women. It preserves them, the way pressure preserves things at the bottom of the sea, intact and out of reach. Follow the last heiress for one paragraph, because the arithmetic of this family runs through her. Athina, Christina's daughter, inherited the surviving Onassis fortune at 3 years old. The 4th generation of this story's women to receive at birth a file instead of a childhood. She was raised in Switzerland by her father, away from Greece, away from the name's gravity, and in the next century, the family sold even Skorpios itself, the island with the chapel and the 2 graves nearest its heart. The dynasty that 2 teenage weddings had built in 1946 and 1947 had within one human lifetime, no fleet, no island, and one descendant who has spent her life declining to discuss any of it. It is difficult to blame her. Even the great stage properties of this story ended as exhibits. The Christina, the floating court where Tina reigned and her children grew up among strangers, was handed by Christina to the Greek state in the late 1970s and spent years as an official yacht, government furniture with a Renoir-shaped absence in it. Decades later, new money restored her for charter, and today anyone with the fee can drink at the Whale-Tooth Bar, where Churchill dozed and Callas laughed, and a 17-year-old bride once learned what she had been traded into. The ship outlived every member of the family that made her famous. Ships, in this story, always did. And Stavros Niarchos. He outlived his rival by 21 years. He outlived Eugenia by 26, Tina by 22, Christina by 8. He raced his horses, kept his island, bought his pictures, gave his name to a foundation whose grants now touch half of Greece. He married no one after Tina. He declined, for the rest of his life, to discuss either sister on any record this film could find. He died in Zurich in April 1996, at 86, in his bed, unaccused of old age, which is the one death this story never granted its women. The last man standing on the chessboard was the one the file had described. That is not an accusation. It is arithmetic, and this family always did respect arithmetic. Between 1975 and the end of the century, the Onassis story was retold on a scale very few private lives ever receive, and every retelling made Tina smaller. This was not a conspiracy. It was a market. Watch how a market forgets. Within 3 years of Onassis's death, the film industry produced its lightly fictionalized tycoon picture, A Greek shipping colossus played for glamour and appetite, his women arranged around him like ports of call. The publishing industry followed with wave after wave. The widow books, the Callas books, the empire books. Television found the story inexhaustible, and each product faced the same commercial arithmetic. Jacqueline sold covers, Callas sold arias and heartbreak. The living, litigious, and luminous claimed the space, and the dead first wife, who had no estate manager for her memory, no fan base, no archive of interviews, slipped quietly from subject to scenery. Study how the mechanics of that shrinkage actually operate, because they are the same for every erased woman this channel has ever covered. First, the woman becomes her function, the first wife. Then the function becomes a transition. He divorced Tina and pursued Callas. Then the transition becomes a clause, previously married to the former Athina Livanos. And finally the clause becomes a caption under a photograph nobody chose carefully. 4 editorial generations, maybe 25 years, and a woman who hosted Churchill out-negotiated Onassis and survived the century's strangest bereavement, becomes a face in the background of other people's biographies. Eugenia's case fared even worse, because her erasure had help. A closed file is a gift to forgetting. With no trial, there was no transcript, no testimony, no annual anniversary for the press to mark. The Spezzapoula incident lived on in the memoirs of journalists and in a paragraph of every Niarchos profile, always carefully lawyered, always ending in the same word, cleared, legally impeccable, historically anesthetic. The paragraph performed its duty and moved the reader along, decade after decade, until the woman inside it was a footnote wearing a bruise. And here a documentary has to be honest about its own species. Films like this one are part of the same market. The difference this film can offer is not purity, it is order of operations. The record first, the rulings stated plainly, the gaps left visible, and the woman placed at the center of her own file instead of at the edge of everyone else's. That is the whole method, and Tina Livanos is exactly the case it was built for. Go back to the morning we started with, the 10th of October, 1974. The maid in the doorway of a bedroom in the 7th arrondissement, and in the bed, a small blonde woman, 45 years old, who had spent her entire existence being described by her relationship to other people. Daughter of Livanos, wife of Onassis, sister of Eugenia, Marchioness of Blandford, Mrs. Niarchos, the predecessor of Jacqueline, the woman before Callas. Now count what the world did with her memory, because the erasure was not an accident. Erasure is maintenance, and somebody always does the maintenance. The Callas industry needed Tina as a footnote, the wronged wife who exits in Act 1, so the great doomed romance can begin. The Kennedy industry needed her even smaller, a parenthesis before Jackie, the first Mrs., whose existence slightly complicates a wedding the century preferred to watch clean. The Onassis biographies needed her as motive and furniture, the dowry that launched him, the divorce that freed him. Her sister's death was inconvenient for everyone and was folded into a single cautious paragraph. Cleared man, closed case, move along. By the time the films and the documentaries came, the 2 Livanos sisters had been compressed into establishing shots. Rich girls, sad ends. Next slide. Here is what the compression left out, and what this film was made to put back. It left out that the 2 most famous fortunes of the 20th century were built on the backs of 2 teenage marriages, arranged like charter contracts, and that neither bride was ever once in any surviving document, asked what she wanted. It left out Arietta, the mother, who is barely a sentence in any book you can buy, and who outlived both of her daughters. Whatever the cost of this story was, she paid the longest installment of it, in a silence so complete that history cannot even quote her grief. It left out the people who actually found this history, twice. Both sisters were discovered by household staff. A servant entering a bedroom on an island in 1970, a maid entering a bedroom in Paris in 1974. Their names appear in no index. They testified, where they testified, into sealed files, and carried what they saw into a working retirement no biographer ever visited. The most intimate witnesses this story produced are the only participants history never bothered to name, and there is no fixing that now. It can only be said aloud, once, in a film like this one. It left out that the archive itself cannot hold on to Tina. She appears in the records under 5 names: Athina and Tina, Onassis and Blandford and Niarchos, a woman filed and refiled under the men of each decade, so that even a careful researcher has to chase her through the indexes of other people's lives. The filing system is the biography. That is what being a treaty does to a person's paperwork. It left out that when the machine finally cut Tina loose in 1959, she out-negotiated the greatest negotiator alive, filed on her own terms, protected her dignity with a stranger's name, and refused for the rest of her life to say one public word against him, or against the singer, or against the widow. Silence was the only estate she ever fully owned, and she managed it flawlessly. It left out that the file on Spetsopoula was real, that a serious prosecutor read every page of it and asked for a trial, that a court said no, and that both of those things remain true at once. This film has not told you Stavros Niarchos harmed his wife. The courts of Greece say he did not, and no evidence has ever overturned them. What this film has told you is that a woman died with bruises on her body in a rich man's house, that the machinery of 2 families and 1 dictatorship arranged itself around the question, and that the only person who could have answered it was buried in Lausanne before the file was even numbered. Lay the 5 layers of this story flat, one final time, so you can see the whole machine at once. The myth says, a golden Greek romance, a fairy tale wedding, a sad divorce, and then the great love stories, Callas and Jackie, with a first wife, somewhere in the prologue. The record says an arranged transaction at 17, a marriage run like a subsidiary, a betrayal managed with more discipline than the betrayer ever showed, and a woman who then walked, twice, back into the machinery that had consumed her sister. The gap between myth and record is where Tina Livanos actually lived, and it is 28 years wide. The cost was paid in 3 bedrooms, on an island, in a mansion, in a bathtub, by 3 women whose combined age at death was 125, and the silence that followed was not an accident of history. It was purchased, maintained, and inherited by industries that needed the widow luminous, the singer tragic, and the first wife conveniently small. And it left out the question that has no file at all: why Tina married him. You have heard the 3 theories: comfort, arithmetic, habit. Here is the 4th, the one her friends whispered, and no one can prove, so take it as speculation and nothing more. That she wanted to stand inside the house her sister died in and see for herself. If that was the reason, she never told a soul, and whatever she found there, she took to the same cemetery. Here is the strangest hole in the whole archive. For a woman, photographed across 4 decades, from the cathedral steps of 1946 to the pavements of Paris. Almost nothing of her voice survives. A few formal statements through lawyers, a line to the press in 1959, courtesies recorded at parties by people writing about someone else, tens of thousands of frames of her face, and barely a paragraph of her actual speech. The men of this story dictated memoirs, gave interviews by the hundred, litigated their versions into the permanent record. The woman at the center of 3 of the century's most public marriages left, in her own words, practically nothing. Either no one ever asked her, or she understood better than anyone that in her world, testimony was the one luxury a woman could not afford. Her silence was not emptiness. It was policy, kept without a single lapse for 45 years, and it worked so completely that history mistook it for absence. We cannot know her mind. The record we have instead is smaller and harder. A wedding at 17 that she did not arrange. A divorce at 30 that she did. A file at 41 that she never spoke of. A marriage at 42 that she never explained. A bedroom at 45 and a daughter outside it, demanding the one honest examination anyone in that family ever got. The world called her the luckiest woman alive. It said the same about Jacqueline in 1968, standing on Skorpios. It had said it about Eugenia in 1947, catching the second richest man in Greece. 3 coronations of the same title, and you have now seen where 2 of the 3 reigns ended. The luckiest women alive. Luck, in this family, was a freight contract, and the freight was them. Only the outsider walked away. Jacqueline, the one bride who had not been raised inside the Greek machine, took her settlement, went back to New York, built a working life at a publishing desk of all places, and died in her own bed decades later, mourned on her own terms. It can be done, is the point. The machine could be survived, but surviving it required something neither Livanos' daughter was ever issued: an exit that did not lead through another wing of the same house. Athina Mary Livanos lies in the Bois de Vaux cemetery in Lausanne, a few steps from Eugenia. Their father rests in the same ground, the man who priced the ships, priced the marriages, and outlived neither consequence. There is no epitaph the guidebooks bother to quote, just the names and the dates and the arithmetic. Eugenia, dead at 43 in her husband's house. Tina, dead at 45 in her husband's house. And between the 2 headstones, a walk of a few seconds, the exact distance the 20th century kept between what it did to those 2 women and what it was willing to remember. The maid called for help on the 10th of October, 1974. Help had been due for 28 years. It never once arrived. 3 years later and 4 kilometers away, another woman who had loved Aristotle Onassis was found dead in another Paris apartment, with the curtains drawn and the record player waiting. But that file belongs to another evening.